Don Nichols and his son Dan were on the hunt. The mountain survivalists were in the woods in Big Sky, Montana looking for a woman. Any woman. And that woman would become Dan's mountain bride. The pair would enact their twisted fantasy when they kidnapped 22-year-old Kari Swenson. By the time it was all over, one person would be dead. Kari Swenson was a college student at Montana State University studying microbiology. But she wasn't just a typical student. She was a world-class biathlon athlete. She was working at the Lone Mountain Ranch in Big Sky, Montana for the summer. Working at the ranch allowed her to save for school as well as train for Team USA during the off-season. The ranch also offered housing for staff, so Kari was able to train in the mountains 6 days a week after her morning shifts. On July 15, 1984, Kari Swenson ended her morning shift with a run. It was the same routine she did every afternoon. But this run was different. She heard about a trail near a spot called Ulrich Lakes and decided to drive there alone and look for it herself. It was a scenic route and everything was fine until halfway through her run. That's when she spotted two dirty-looking men dressed in camo watching her. Kari's intuition told her that something was wrong with these men and briefly considered turning around. But instead, she decided to ignore their leering gazes and run past them. The men stepped in front of her and blocked her way. One of the men was 53-year-old Don Nichols. He asked her if she worked in the kitchen at the Big Sky Resort, and she said yes. And then he asked if she was married. Without hesitation, she lied and said yes. Don and his companion continued to block her way and badgered her with questions that felt more like an interrogation. He asked her about her husband and why she wasn't wearing a wedding ring. Kari desperately wanted to end this conversation, so she made up a fake husband and told Don that she and her husband didn't wear rings. Don looked at his son, 19-year-old Dan Nichols, and asked,
"You think she's married, Danny?"
No, I don't. All women lie.
Dan had found his mountain bride. Don grabbed Kari's wrists and tried to pull her away. Kari yelled at him and tried to escape, but he wouldn't let her go. On the contrary, Don tried to reassure her that he and his son were only taking her into the mountains to see if she liked living with them. Kari desperately fought back, but Don hit her on the head so hard that he knocked her down. Don climbed on top of her and held down a very disoriented Kari, and with the help of his son, they tied her up. As the pair looked down on their captured prey, Don asked his son, "Well, Danny, do you want to keep her?" And Dan nodded, "Yeah, let's keep her." The Nichols marched her deep into the forest, with Don pointing a shotgun at Kari's back. As they walked, Don told Kari that she would love living in the mountains with them. They walked for hours, and when night fell, the trio stopped at a small clearing. Don and Dan wrapped a chain around Kari's waist and tied her up to a tree to prevent her from escaping. Don left to go hunt a squirrel and left Kari with Dan. Kari was left alone with a man who was only a few years younger than herself. She feared the worst when Dan began showing his drawings of naked women. She cried and begged for him to let her go, but he said, "No, I want to keep you. You're pretty, and I want to keep you." Kari repeated that she was already married, but he replied that he knew she was lying because she wasn't wearing a wedding ring. When Don Nichols returned, Kari begged for them not to sexually assault her. Don looked at her confused and explained that they weren't going to hurt her and reiterated that they only wanted to keep her until she decided that she wanted to stay. Tied to a tree with two delusional men, she prayed that someone would rescue her. When Kari didn't show up for her dinner shift that same day, her brother Paul and other co-workers were worried because this wasn't like her. They went to look for her at Ulrich Lakes and saw her empty car was still there. Paul immediately called his parents. There were grizzly bear sightings earlier that week, and the family feared that Kari might have had an encounter with one. Family and friends joined the search, and Kari's father even had a friend with a helicopter fly over the area to cover more ground. As Kari's family and friends searched for her, she could hear them calling her name and even heard the helicopter. Kari tried to convince the Nichols that they needed to let her go because people were looking for her, but the Nichols weren't concerned. Don told her that if anyone found them, he would kill them. As the voices grew distant and the sounds of the helicopter disappeared, Kari didn't lose hope. True to their word, the men didn't touch her, and the trio slept in that clearing undisturbed. The search continued the next morning as Kari's friend Alan Goldstein and rancher Jim Schwalbe returned to the lakes. This time, it didn't take long for the men to find her. They pushed past some bushes and saw Kari tied to a tree. But instead of feeling relieved, Kari was terrified. While the Nichols promised not to hurt her, they also promised to kill anyone that tried to take her away from them. Kari started screaming at her rescuers to leave and frantically told them that the Nichols would kill them if they moved any closer. Don panicked. He didn't anticipate getting caught so soon, and as Kari screamed, he told Dan to shut her up. Without any hesitation, Dan walked up to Kari, looked up at her rescuers, then looked back down at her, and shot her point blank in the chest. Jim immediately rushed to Kari's aid as she lay bleeding on the ground. Alan yelled for the men to surrender, but Don had no plans on getting arrested. He raised his shotgun and shot Alan in the face. Before Don could shoot Jim, he escaped to get help. The Nichols unchained Kari and dumped her out of the sleeping bag and left her for dead. Kari couldn't move. She was in excruciating pain, and every breath taken was followed by a gurgling of blood. It was the first time she truly thought that she would die after being kidnapped. However, thanks to her breath control training as a biathlon athlete, as well as being in peak physical condition, she was able to survive 4 hours before help would arrive. It was discovered that the bullet entered Kari's chest just under the collarbone and exited out the shoulder blade, leaving her with a collapsed lung. Unfortunately, 36-year-old Alan Goldstein didn't survive his wounds and was pronounced dead at the scene. Kari stayed in the hospital for 8 days before she returned home. As she was recuperating, something strange was happening in the media. Instead of news outlets presenting the crime as a violent kidnapping and murder, the narrative was romanticized. The story of 2 mountain men that kidnapped a woman to be the younger one's bride sounded like a story straight out of an old Western movie. It was so bizarre that media from all over the country swarmed Big Sky. The crime created such a media circus that Madison County Sheriff Johnny France ended up being profiled in Esquire magazine. The Nichols were being mythologized as 2 men who had shunned the modern world and lived off the land. Sheriff France compared Don Nichols to Daniel Boone and that Dan was a nice boy. They portrayed Kari as a woman who was being swept off her feet by some wild adventurer that only wanted a wife. Sympathetic news articles were written about the men, and one article even had the audacity to suggest that Kari being shot was an accident. Kari's father had to put out a statement reminding the media that these men kidnapped and tried to murder his daughter and successfully killed a rescuer. There was nothing romantic about the crimes they committed. For 5 months, the Nichols were on the run. The pair moved through the forest without being found, all while eluding Montana deputies, the FBI, and a special SWAT team. But their luck finally ran out on December 13, 1984. The money to continue the search ran out, and so Sheriff France decided that he would search for them alone. The week before, he received a tip from a rancher that said he found what he believed to be the Nichols' campsite. Sheriff France rode a snowmobile within 4 miles of the hideout and then trekked the rest of the way on foot through the deep snow. Dressed in white camouflage, he spotted the Nichols at their campsite. When Don saw the sheriff, he reached for his gun and the sheriff told him,
I raised my rifle right about here, and I yelled at him not to do anything foolish. I said, please don't make me kill you.
Sheriff France expected the men to fight and that there would be a vicious shootout, but there was no shootout, and Sheriff France was able to talk to the pair and convince them to turn themselves in. The Nichols were frustrated and surprised that they were caught, but eventually they relented and they were arrested that day. In May 1985, Dan Nichols went to trial. Charged with kidnapping, assault and murder, the defense argued that Dan was a puppet to his domineering father and that he only did what he was told. During the trial, it was revealed that Dan was in the foster care system for an unknown reason. His foster parents testified that Dan idolized his father and was wrapped up in his father's dreams of living off the land and finding a bride. Dan ran away from their home at 15 to be with his father. On May 13, 1985, Dan Nichols was convicted of kidnapping and assault, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. In 1991, he was released from prison. In July 1985, Don Nichols went to trial with the same charges as his son. But bizarrely, his defense argued that Alan Goldstein's murder was an act of self-defense. They claimed that Alan pointed a gun at Don and Dan, and so Don shot Alan. But in Montana law, a person can't claim self-defense in the process of committing a felony. And so, Don was convicted of murder, kidnapping, and assault, and sentenced to 85 years in prison. He was released in 2017 after serving 32 years at the age of 85. It took months for Kari to fully recover from her injuries, but she would eventually be able to join Team USA's Biathlon team once again. The story of two mountain men kidnapping a woman to be a bride was such a sensational story that in 1987, the TV movie The Abduction of Kari Swenson was aired. Kari acted as a technical advisor and did her own stunts for the movie. It would later come to light that Don Nichols and his son weren't mountain men. They lived on the mountain part-time while breaking into cabins and stealing supplies. The reason why they were caught? Because they were cold, hungry, and had nowhere else to go. Kari received a degree from Colorado State University Veterinary School in 1990. Today, she is a practicing veterinarian. Thank you for watching the Twin Files. Don't forget to like and subscribe. So, what did you guys think? We were really caught on how they decided we're going to kidnap a woman and don't even have a shack to offer her, not even a teepee. What was their grand plan? We're not trying to make light of the situation, but if you're going to kidnap a person, at least make sure that you have a shack. I think Kari was shack worthy. Are you shack worthy? Let us know in the comments.